father, and was rejoiced to have an opportunity of meeting Alethea, whom I had not seen for some few years, but with whom I had been in constant correspondence. She and I had always been friends from the time we had played together as children onwards. When the death of her grandfather and grandmother severed her connection with Paleham, my intimacy with the Pontifexes was kept up by my having been at school and college with Theobald, and each time I saw her I admired her more and more, as the best, kindest, wittiest, most lovable, and to my mind handsomest woman whom I had ever seen. None of the Pontifexes were deficient in good looks. They were a well-grown shapely family enough, but Alethea was the flower of the flock even as regards good looks, while in respect of all other qualities that make a woman lovable, it seems as though the stock that had been intended for the three daughters, and would have been about sufficient for them, had all been allotted to herself, her sisters getting none, and she all. It is impossible for me to explain how it was that she and I never married. We two knew exceedingly well, and that must suffice for the reader. There was the most perfect sympathy and understanding between us. We knew that neither of us would marry anyone else. I had asked her to marry me a dozen times over. Having said this much, I will say no more upon a point which is in no way necessary for the development of my story. For the last few years there had been difficulties in the way of our meeting, and I had not seen her, though, as I have said, keeping up a close correspondence with her. Naturally I was overjoyed to meet her again. She was now just 30 years old, but I thought she looked handsomer than ever. Her father, of course, was the lion of the party, but seeing that we were all meek and quite willing to be eaten, he roared to us rather than at us. It was a fine sight to see him tucking his napkin under his rosy old gills, and letting it fall over his capacious waistcoat, while the high light from the chandelier danced about the bump of benevolence on his bald old head, like a star of Bethlehem. The soup was real turtle. The old gentleman was evidently well pleased, and he was beginning to come out. Gilstrap stood behind his master's chair. I sat next Mrs. Theobald on her left hand, and was thus just opposite her father-in-law, whom I had every opportunity of observing. During the first 10 minutes or so, which were taken up with the soup and the bringing in of the fish, I should probably have thought, if I had not long since made up my mind about him, what a fine old man he was, and how proud his children should be of him. But suddenly, as he was helping himself to lobster sauce, he flushed crimson. A look of extreme vexation suffused his face, and he darted 2 furtive but fiery glances to the 2 ends of the table, one for Theobald and one for Christina. They, poor simple souls, of course, saw that something was exceedingly wrong, and so did I, but I couldn't guess what it was till I heard the old man hiss in Christina's ear, "It was not made with a hen lobster. What's the use," he continued, "of my calling the boy Ernest and getting him christened in water from the Jordan, if his own father does not know a cock from a hen lobster?" This cut me too, for I felt till that moment I had not so much as known that there were cocks and hens among lobsters, but had vaguely thought that in the matter of matrimony they were even as the angels in heaven, and grew up almost spontaneously from rocks and seaweed. Before the next course was over Mr. Pontifex had recovered his temper, and from that time to the end of the evening he was at his best. He told us all about the water from the Jordan, how it had been brought by Dr. Jones along with some stone jars of water from the Rhine, the Rhone, the Elbe, and the Danube, and what trouble he had with them at the customs houses, and how the intention had been to make punch with waters from all the greatest rivers in Europe, and how he, Mr. Pontifex, had saved the Jordan water from going into the bowl, etc., etc. "No, no, no," he continued, "it wouldn't have done at all, you know. Very profane idea. so we each took a pint bottle of it home with us, and the punch was much better without it. I had a narrow escape with mine, though, the other day. I fell over a hamper in the cellar when I was getting it up to bring to Battersby, and if I had not taken the greatest care, the bottle would certainly have been broken. But I saved it. And Gelstrap was standing behind his chair all the time. Nothing more happened to ruffle Mr. Pontifex, so we had a delightful evening, which has often recurred to me while watching the after-career of my godson. I called a day or two afterwards and found Mr. Pontifex still at Battersby, laid up with one of those attacks of liver and depression to which he was becoming more and more subject. I stayed to luncheon. The old gentleman was cross and very difficult. He could eat nothing, had no appetite at all. Christina tried to coax him with a little bit of the fleshy part of a mutton chop. "How in the name of reason can I be asked to eat a mutton chop?" he exclaimed angrily. "You forget, my dear Christina, that you have to deal with a stomach that is totally disorganized." And he pushed the plate from him, pouting and frowning like a naughty old child. Writing as I do by the light of a later knowledge, I suppose I should have seen nothing in this but the world's growing pains, the disturbance inseparable from transition in human things. I suppose in reality not a leaf goes yellow in autumn without ceasing to care about its sap, and making the parent tree very uncomfortable by long growling and grumbling. But surely nature might find some less irritating way of carrying on business if she would give her mind to it. Why should the generations overlap one another at all? Why cannot we be buried as eggs in neat little cells with 10 or 20,000 pounds each wrapped round us in Bank of England notes, and wake up, as the Sphex does, to find its papa and mamma have not only left ample provision at its elbow, but have been eaten by sparrows some weeks before it began to live consciously on its own account? About a year and a half afterwards the tables were turned on Battersby, for Mrs. John Pontifex was safely delivered of a boy. A year or so later still, George Pontifex was himself struck down suddenly by a fit of paralysis, much as his mother had been, but he did not see the years of his mother. When his will was opened, it was found that an original bequest of £20,000 to Theobald himself, over and above the sum that had been settled upon him and Christina at the time of his marriage, had been cut down to £17,500 when Mr. Pontifex left something to Ernest. The something proved to be £2,500, which was to accumulate in the hands of trustees. The rest of the property went to John Pontifex, except that each of the daughters was left with about £15,000 over and above £5,000 apiece which they had inherited from their mother. Theobald's father, then, had told him the truth, but not the whole truth. Nevertheless, what right had Theobald to complain? Certainly it was rather hard to make him think that he and his were to be gainers, and get the honour and glory of the bequest, when all the time the money was virtually being taken out of Theobald's own pocket. On the other hand, the father doubtless argued that he had never told Theobald he was to have anything at all. He had a full right to do what he liked with his own money. If Theobald chose to indulge in unwarrantable expectations, that was no affair of his. As it was, he was providing for him liberally, and if he did take £2,500 of Theobald's share, he was still leaving it to Theobald's son, which, of course, was much the same thing in the end. No one can deny that the testator has strict right upon his side. Nevertheless, the reader will agree with me that Theobald and Christina might not have considered the christening dinner so great a success if all the facts had been before them. Mr. Pontifex had during his own lifetime set up a monument in Elmhurst Church to the memory of his wife, a slab with urns and cherubs like illegitimate children of King George IV, and all the rest of it, and had left space for his own epitaph underneath that of his wife. I do not know whether it was written by